Imagine boarding a routine flight, only to realize your pilots are missing, your crew is disappearing one by one, and the person landing the plane isn't who you think. What would you do at 35,000 feet with nowhere to run? Stay tuned, because this is a flight you'll never forget. Before we dive in, let us know. What time are you listening to this, and where are you? Drop a comment below. We'd love to hear from you. Naomi Hensley adjusted her uniform one last time before stepping out of the break room. The scent of freshly brewed coffee lingered in the air, mixing with the faint smell of jet fuel that always clung to her clothes after a long shift. It was nearly midnight at Los Angeles International Airport, and she had just finished a cross-country flight to New York. Her feet ached. The tight bun on top of her head was giving her a dull headache, but she kept her posture straight. The terminal was still buzzing. Businessmen scrolling through emails, exhausted families trying to soothe cranky toddlers, and airport workers moving luggage carts with quiet efficiency. Naomi had done this routine hundreds of times, but tonight felt different. As she walked through the terminal, she caught sight of her reflection in one of the tall glass windows. The deep blue of her Celestial Airways uniform was crisp, perfectly pressed. But her eyes carried something else. Fatigue, maybe. Or was it something deeper? She'd been with Celestial Airways for almost 6 years. She loved flying, loved the feeling of stepping onto a plane and knowing she was responsible for ensuring everyone's safety. But lately the job had felt heavier. It wasn't just the long hours or the demanding passengers. It was the whispers among the crew, the quiet dismissals of safety concerns, the unspoken rule to keep your head down if you wanted to keep your job. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from a former colleague, someone she hadn't heard from in a while. Lisa. Hey, I know it's late, but I needed to warn you. They just fired another flight attendant for reporting a maintenance issue. Be careful. Naomi stopped in her tracks. A pit formed in her stomach. This wasn't the first time she had heard about a crew member being let go for speaking up. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to keep moving. This was a dangerous game Celestial played, prioritizing image over safety. She had always told herself she wouldn't get involved, that she would do her job, collect her paycheck, and stay out of trouble. But as she headed toward the employee shuttle, she couldn't shake the thought, what if one day she was the one forced to choose between her integrity and her career? The night air was cooler than she expected as she stepped outside. The shuttle was already waiting, its headlights casting long shadows across the pavement. As she climbed aboard, she noticed another crew member, a first officer, staring out the window, lost in thought. She considered striking up a conversation but hesitated. What would she even say? Instead, she found an empty seat near the back, letting her head rest against the window. The city lights blurred past, and for a moment she closed her eyes. A voice from the front of the shuttle brought her back. Did you hear about the engine issue on Flight 417 last year? They never reported it. Naomi's eyes snapped open. She didn't know it yet, but this was the moment everything would change. The first thing Naomi noticed when she stepped onto the aircraft was the forced cheerfulness in the air. Crew members exchanged polite smiles, passengers settled into their seats, and the faint chime of announcements hummed through the cabin. But beneath it all, there was tension, something unspoken. She moved through the aisles, assisting passengers, adjusting overhead bins, making sure everything appeared normal. That was the job, after all. Even when something felt wrong, you smiled, reassured, and kept moving. As she passed by the galley, she caught sight of the lead flight attendant, Claire Reynolds, whispering to one of the pilots. Their conversation was hushed, but the urgency in Claire's face was unmistakable. Naomi slowed her steps, pretending to check a passenger's seatbelt as she listened. We're taking off in 10 minutes, the pilot muttered. It's already been signed off. Claire glanced toward Naomi, then quickly turned back. I don't like this. We should delay. There's nothing to delay, the pilot shot back. Just do your job. Naomi felt a chill crawl up her spine. She'd seen this before. Crew members being pressured to overlook concerns, to pretend that everything was fine when it wasn't. She continued down the aisle, her mind racing. Should she say something? Would anyone even listen? As she reached the last row, she noticed a man in business attire adjusting his watch. He caught her gaze and gave a polite nod. She returned the gesture, but something about him lingered in her mind. It wasn't his presence. It was the way he had been watching. Not just her, but everything. The final boarding announcement played overhead, and Naomi took her position near the front of the cabin. The engines roared to life, vibrating beneath her feet as the plane taxied to the runway. She stole one last glance at Claire, whose expression was unreadable. The plane lifted off, piercing through the dark sky. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a voice whispered, "This flight wasn't like the others." Naomi had always found a strange comfort in the routine of a flight. Passengers settling in, the rhythmic chime of announcements, the gentle hum of engines beneath the floor. But tonight, that comfort felt like a fragile illusion, one that could shatter at any moment. She moved through the cabin, offering warm smiles, answering requests, keeping her hands busy. That was the best way to ignore the gnawing unease that had lodged itself deep in her stomach ever since the quiet exchange between Claire and the pilot. As she reached row 17, a man waved her over. He looked like the kind of passenger who flew often, neatly dressed, composed, the type who always ordered black coffee and never needed anything beyond the basics. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but deliberate. "Did something happen before takeoff?" Naomi blinked. "What do you mean?" The man glanced around, as if gauging whether anyone was listening. He leaned in slightly. "I noticed the crew looked tense, and the delay before pushback unusual for this airline." Naomi forced a polite smile. "We had some final checks to complete before departure. Nothing out of the ordinary." He studied her for a moment before nodding, as if deciding not to press further. "Right. Just curious." She turned to leave, but his presence lingered in her mind. Something about him felt sharp, like he was taking in details others ignored. As she made her way back to the galley, she found Claire standing by the beverage cart, her grip on the handle a little too tight. "Everything all right?" Naomi asked, keeping her tone casual. Claire hesitated before exhaling. "I don't know. Maybe I'm just paranoid. But I don't like this flight." Naomi frowned. "Because of what you were talking about earlier?" Claire's eyes flicked toward the cockpit door before she nodded. "Just keep your eyes open." Naomi wanted to ask more, to press for details, but a chime from the intercom cut through the moment. "Flight attendants, prepare for meal service." The routine took over, and Naomi fell back into her role. But as she moved through the aisles, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Somewhere around the midpoint of the flight, she stepped into the forward galley for a moment of reprieve. The quiet hum of the plane filled the space, a stark contrast to the murmur of the cabin. Then a sound, so subtle she almost missed it. A faint, rhythmic clicking. Her pulse quickened. She turned her head slightly, trying to pinpoint the source. It wasn't coming from the cabin. It was the cockpit. She took a step closer, listening. The clicking stopped. The hair on the back of her neck stood up. She had no idea what it was, but she knew one thing for certain. This flight was carrying more than just passengers. By the time Naomi reached the back galley, her heartbeat had settled into a steady but alert rhythm. She wasn't the kind to jump to conclusions, but experience had taught her that instincts were rarely wrong. She grabbed a water bottle and leaned against the counter, letting the cold plastic press into her palm as she collected her thoughts. What had she just heard? Was it something mechanical? A normal cockpit function? Or was it, "Hey, Naomi"? She looked up to see one of the junior flight attendants, Jake, stepping into the galley. He was fresh out of training, still eager, still convinced that the worst thing that could happen on a flight was a spilled drink. "You okay?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Naomi hesitated before nodding. "Yeah, just a long night." Jake leaned against the counter, lowering his voice. "I saw you talking to Claire earlier. She seems different tonight." Naomi glanced toward the front of the plane, where Claire was adjusting a passenger's blanket. "She's got a bad feeling about this flight." Jake let out a breath. "You think she knows something we don't?" Before Naomi could answer, a voice crackled over the intercom. "Lead flight attendant to the cockpit." She exchanged a glance with Jake. Claire hesitated for a split second before stepping forward and disappearing through the cockpit door. Seconds stretched into minutes. 5, then 10. Naomi busied herself serving drinks, but she kept glancing toward the front, waiting for Claire to reappear. When the door finally opened, Claire stepped out, her face a mask of professionalism, but Naomi saw it, the tension in her jaw, the stiffness in her shoulders. Naomi didn't wait. The moment Claire reached the galley, she whispered, "What happened?" Claire hesitated, then leaned in. "The captain told me to stop asking questions." Naomi's stomach dropped. "Questions about what?" Claire shook her head. "He wouldn't say. Just told me to do my job and keep quiet." Naomi felt a prickle of fear creep up her spine. She had been flying long enough to know what normal looked like, and this wasn't it. She exhaled slowly. "Claire, if something's wrong, we need to know." Claire met her gaze, her expression unreadable. Then finally she spoke. "There was an issue before takeoff. Something about the avionics system. They were supposed to delay the flight, but they didn't." Naomi's fingers tightened around the water bottle. The avionics system controlled everything. Navigation, communication, the plane's entire operation. And they had taken off knowing something was wrong. A sense of dread settled over her, heavy and suffocating. She turned to look out the small galley window. Outside, the dark sky stretched endlessly in every direction. They were thousands of feet above the earth, trapped in a metal tube, and something was wrong. And the worst part? No one was coming to help. Naomi felt the chill of realization settle deep in her bones. This wasn't just a bad feeling anymore. It was real. Something was wrong, and the people who should have been fixing it had chosen to ignore it. She glanced around the cabin, scanning the passengers. Most were oblivious, some watching movies, others asleep under flimsy airline blankets. A few sipped drinks or whispered quietly to their seatmates, completely unaware of the silent storm brewing behind the scenes. Her eyes landed on the man from earlier, the one who had questioned her about the delay. He was still watching, not at her, but at everything. The flight crew, the movement of the attendants, the subtle interactions between staff. He wasn't a nervous flyer. He was observing. Naomi took a slow breath and turned back to Claire. "Did they say how serious it is?" Claire shook her head, her fingers tapping against the counter. An unconscious tick Naomi had never seen from her before. "Just that it's been logged and handled. But handled how? By who? No one's talking." Naomi frowned. "And the first officer, did he say anything?" Claire hesitated, glancing toward the cockpit door. "That's the thing. I didn't see him. Only the captain spoke to me." Naomi's pulse quickened. The first officer should have been present during that conversation. If he wasn't, that meant one of two things. Either he was dealing with something urgent, or he wasn't able to. A slow dread crept up her spine. "We need to find out what's going on," Naomi murmured. Claire nodded, but before either of them could say more, the intercom chimed again. "Flight attendants, please prepare for turbulence." The words were routine, but the tone wasn't. It was clipped, almost rehearsed. Naomi knew turbulence warnings were usually issued ahead of time, but the flight had been smooth for hours. She felt it then, the slightest shudder beneath her feet. It wasn't the kind of turbulence that made passengers panic. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. She reached for the intercom and paged the cockpit. "Lead flight attendant to flight deck." Silence. She tried again. Nothing. Claire's face paled. "They're not answering." Naomi's grip on the handset tightened. This wasn't turbulence. This was something else. And they were on their own. Naomi knew she had only one option, to go up there herself. She exchanged a glance with Claire, then made her way down the aisle, weaving past passengers. She kept her expression neutral, her smile in place, but inside every nerve in her body was on high alert. As she approached the cockpit, she noticed something strange. The door wasn't locked. It should have been. She hesitated only for a second before knocking. "Captain, it's Naomi, requesting entry." No answer. She knocked again. Louder this time. Still nothing. Something was very, very wrong. Her hand hovered over the keypad. Crew members had emergency access, but she had never needed to use it before. The rule was simple. Flight attendants didn't enter the cockpit unless explicitly invited. But if the pilots weren't responding, that changed everything. She punched in the code. The lock clicked open. Naomi pushed the door inward, just enough to see. The cockpit was dim, illuminated only by the soft glow of control panels. The captain sat in his seat, staring straight ahead, fingers gripping the yoke so tightly his knuckles were white, and the first officer's seat was empty. Naomi stepped inside, the air thick with something she couldn't name. "Captain?" The man didn't turn his head, didn't blink. Her stomach twisted. "Where's the first officer?" Nothing. She took another cautious step forward, and that's when she saw it. The first officer's headset was lying on the floor, and next to it, his pilot's wings, placed neatly on the center console as if he had set them down himself. A chill ran through Naomi's veins. She turned back toward the cabin, scanning the passengers. Someone on this flight knew exactly what was happening, and she had a sinking feeling they were watching her right now. Naomi forced herself to stay calm. She had to. Panic wasn't an option at 35,000 feet. She took a step back, her heart pounding, and glanced at the captain. His breathing was shallow, his posture stiff. He looked awake, but something was off. "Captain?" She tried again, this time placing a hand lightly on his shoulder. His head turned slightly, just enough for her to see his face. His skin was clammy, his pupils slightly dilated. It was like he was there, but not really. A chill ran through Naomi's spine. She scanned the cockpit quickly. The controls seemed normal. No alarms blaring, no flashing emergency lights. But that meant nothing if the person flying the plane wasn't fully conscious. She needed to get out of there. Now backing away, she pulled the cockpit door shut behind her, locking it again. She forced herself to keep her steps even as she walked down the aisle, even as her mind screamed at her to run. Someone on this flight knew something, and she needed to figure out who. She moved toward the galley where Claire and Jake were waiting, their faces tight with concern. "The first officer is gone," Naomi said quietly. Claire's expression darkened. "Gone? What do you mean gone? Not in the cockpit? And the captain?" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "Something's wrong with him. He's not responding normally." Jake glanced toward the cabin, his throat bobbing as he swallowed hard. "So, what do we do?" Naomi inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "First, we don't let the passengers know anything is wrong. Second, we find out who on this plane saw something. Someone had to have noticed if a pilot walked out of the cockpit mid-flight." Claire nodded. "The guy in 17A. He's been watching everything." Naomi didn't waste a second. She made her way to row 17. The man looked up before she even reached him, as if he had been expecting her. "Miss Hensley." His voice was calm, measured. She froze. She hadn't given him her name. Her pulse quickened. "Sir, I need to ask if you've seen anything unusual on this flight." He studied her for a moment before leaning in. "You're looking for the first officer, aren't you?" Naomi's stomach dropped. The man's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Sit down," he said, patting the empty seat next to him. "I think it's time we had a little chat." Naomi didn't sit. She couldn't. Every instinct in her body screamed to keep her distance. But she also knew she needed answers. She lowered her voice. "Tell me what you know." The man tilted his head slightly, eyes scanning the aisle before settling back on her. "You're asking the wrong question." Naomi's patience was running thin. "All right, where is the first officer?" The man exhaled slowly, then leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "That depends." "On what?" "On whether you're ready to hear the truth." Naomi clenched her jaw. "I don't have time for games." The man gave her a slow, knowing look. "Neither do I." Silence stretched between them. Around them, the cabin remained blissfully unaware. A child laughed a few rows back. The hum of the engines remained steady, but Naomi's world was tilting. "Who are you?" she asked finally. The man smiled faintly. "Let's just say, I know how this airline operates, and I know that this flight isn't supposed to reach its destination." Naomi's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" she whispered. His gaze darkened. "What I mean, Miss Hensley, is that you need to decide very quickly whether you want to survive this flight." Her breath caught in her throat. He sat back, folding his arms. "Now, are you ready to listen?" Naomi could feel her pulse in her throat. Every part of her wanted to turn, walk away, pretend this conversation wasn't happening. But she couldn't. Not now. Not when the first officer had vanished. The captain was barely responsive, and a man who shouldn't know her name was offering answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. She forced herself to stay steady. "I'm listening." The man's expression remained unreadable. "Good." He glanced around, ensuring no one was eavesdropping, then lowered his voice. "Celestial Airways has been covering up safety failures for years. You already know that, don't you?" Naomi didn't answer. She didn't need to. The man continued. "Some of those failures have been mechanical. Others have been more deliberate." He studied her face, watching her reaction. "Tell me, what do you think happens when a corporation starts cutting too many corners?" Naomi's fingers tightened on the seat in front of her. "People get hurt." "Exactly." He leaned in slightly. "But here's the thing. Celestial doesn't just cut corners. They eliminate problems." A cold sensation crawled over Naomi's skin. "What kind of problems?" He met her gaze evenly. "People who ask too many questions." Her breath caught. She thought of Lisa's warning, the flight attendants who had been fired, the maintenance issues that were handled, and now the first officer who had vanished mid-flight. This wasn't just about a malfunction. Someone had planned this. She forced herself to focus. "If you know all of this, why are you telling me?" The man smiled slightly. "Because you seem smarter than most, and because right now, you're running out of time to figure out what's really happening before someone makes you disappear too." Her skin prickled. "What do you mean, disappear?" The man exhaled as if debating how much to say. "Let's just say your first officer isn't the only one who's suddenly missing." Naomi's heart slammed against her ribs. He was right. She had a choice. She could walk away, pretend she hadn't heard this, stay in her lane like she always had, or she could push forward. But if she did, she wasn't sure she'd be getting off this flight alive. Naomi stood frozen, gripping the back of the seat in front of her, feeling the weight of the man's words settle in her chest like cement. The first officer was gone. The captain was compromised. And now this stranger was telling her that people, crew members, maybe even passengers, had been disappearing before they could expose something bigger. Her throat felt tight. "Where is he?" she asked, forcing the words out. The man tilted his head, considering her for a moment. "If I had to guess, he's not on this plane anymore." Her stomach dropped. That was impossible. They were cruising at 35,000 feet. There was no way the first officer could have left unless someone had made sure he did. She swallowed hard. "Did you see anything?" His expression darkened. "Number. But I wasn't supposed to." He nodded toward the galley. "You were, though. That's why you're still standing here." Naomi felt a chill rush through her veins. Before she could respond, a ding from the intercom crackled overhead. "Flight attendants, please report to the forward galley." "Claire." Naomi hesitated. The man exhaled, shaking his head. "Go," he said simply. "But when you're ready for real answers, come back." She didn't trust him, but right now she trusted her own airline even less. She turned and walked toward the galley, her breath steady but her mind spiraling. Claire was waiting, her arms crossed, her face tight. "Something's wrong," she whispered the moment Naomi reached her. Naomi had to bite back a bitter laugh. "No kidding." Claire shook her head. "No, I mean, Jake is gone." Naomi's stomach clenched. "What?" "I went to find him after you left." Claire's voice dropped lower. "He was in the aft galley. I turned around for 10 seconds, Naomi. When I looked back, he was gone." This wasn't just a cover-up anymore. Someone on this plane was making people disappear, and if they didn't act fast, one of them would be next. Naomi felt the cabin shrink around her, the hum of the engine suddenly too loud, the air too thin. Jake was gone. The first officer was gone. The captain was barely functioning, and no one, not the passengers, not the remaining crew, had seen anything. Claire's face was pale, her fingers gripping the counter like it was the only thing keeping her grounded. "Naomi, what the hell is happening?" Naomi took a slow breath, forcing her thoughts into order. "We need to check the entire plane. Every compartment, every storage space. If someone's making people disappear, we need to know how." Claire nodded, but Naomi could see the fear behind her eyes. They weren't trained for this. Their job was to manage turbulence, unruly passengers, emergency landings, things that had protocol, steps, solutions. But this wasn't in any manual. They split up. Claire headed toward the back, checking every lavatory, every unoccupied seat, even the storage compartments. Naomi moved forward, scanning the first-class section, peeking behind curtains, checking the galley storage. She even knocked softly on the cockpit door again, listening. Nothing. As she turned back toward the cabin, she caught sight of the man in 17A. He was still watching, still waiting. She took a step toward him. Then the lights flickered. It was subtle, just a slight dimming, a hesitation in the normally smooth hum of the plane's electrical systems. Naomi froze. Then a scream. "Claire!" Naomi bolted toward the back of the plane, shoving past startled passengers. She found Claire standing outside one of the lavatories, her face drained of color. "What happened?" Naomi gasped. Claire pointed at the door. "It was locked. I knocked. No one answered. Then I heard—" She swallowed hard. "I heard something moving inside." Naomi reached for the handle, ignoring the cold sweat forming at the back of her neck. She knocked. "Jake, are you in there?" Silence. She knocked again, louder. "Jake, if you can hear me, open the door." Still nothing. Claire whispered, "Naomi, maybe we should wait." Naomi didn't wait. She reached for the emergency key, slid it into the lock, and twisted. The door swung open. The lavatory was empty. Completely, utterly empty. No Jake. No sign that anyone had ever been inside. Claire let out a shaky breath. No, he was here. I heard something." Naomi stepped inside, scanning the tiny space. It was clean, untouched. No misplaced objects, no signs of a struggle. But the hairs on the back of her neck were standing. Something wasn't right. She turned to Claire. "We're not imagining this." Claire shook her head. "Then where the hell did he go?" Naomi had no answer, but she was beginning to understand something terrifying. Whatever was happening on this plane, whoever was behind it, they weren't just making people disappear. They were erasing them. Naomi and Claire sat in the back galley, whispering in hushed tones, trying to process the impossible. Jake had been here. He had been standing right where Claire was now. And then, in the span of moments, he was gone. Erased, no luggage, no ID on the crew manifest, no seat assignment. It was as if he had never existed. Claire's hands were trembling as she gripped a cup of water. "This isn't real. This can't be real." Naomi felt the same way. Every logical part of her screamed that there had to be an explanation, a hidden passage, a diversion, a trick. She exhaled, trying to steady herself. If someone's doing this, they're doing it with access to the system. That means they're one of us. Claire's eyes widened. "You think a crew member's involved?" Naomi thought of the first officer's abandoned headset, the neatly placed wings, the way the captain wouldn't meet her eyes. "I think someone on this plane knows more than they're letting on," she said. A voice cut through their conversation. "I warned you, Miss Hensley." Naomi turned. 17A. The man was standing in the aisle now, arms crossed, watching her with something close to amusement. She stood up slowly. "What did you do?" The man tilted his head. "Me?" He chuckled. "I didn't do anything. I'm just here to watch." Claire whispered, "Watch what?" His expression darkened. "To see how long you last." Naomi felt a cold dread creep into her chest. The intercom chimed. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We are beginning our descent into New York." Naomi turned toward the cockpit. That voice. It wasn't the captain. She knew that now. The real captain was still in that seat, barely coherent. Which meant, who the hell was flying the plane? Naomi's stomach twisted. The voice over the intercom had been smooth, practiced, exactly what passengers expected from a seasoned pilot. But she knew better. The real captain was still in his seat, barely responsive. The first officer was gone, and yet the plane was descending, as if nothing was wrong. Claire whispered beside her, "That wasn't him, was it?" Naomi shook her head. It wasn't. A sharp crackle over the speaker made both women flinch. "Flight attendants, prepare the cabin for landing." It was the same voice. Calm, commanding. A voice meant to reassure. but it sent a chill straight through Naomi's bones. The man in 17A was watching, smiling. Naomi turned to Claire. Get everyone seated. Lock the galley doors. Make sure the passengers don't panic. Claire hesitated. And you? Naomi glanced toward the cockpit. I'm going to find out who's flying this plane. Claire's hand gripped her wrist. Naomi, what if you don't come back? Naomi met her eyes. Then don't let them know you're afraid. She turned, moving quickly up the aisle, past passengers, oblivious to the fact that something was deeply, horribly wrong. She reached the cockpit door, took a slow breath. Then she knocked. A pause. Then the lock clicked open. She pushed the door inward and stepped into the unknown. The cockpit was eerily quiet. Naomi's eyes darted to the captain, still in his seat, hands limp at his sides. His breathing was shallow, but he was alive. Barely. And then there was the man in the first officer's seat. He was calm, in control, hands resting lightly on the throttle. He didn't turn, didn't react to her presence at all. For a split second, Naomi thought maybe, just maybe, this was the first officer. Maybe he had returned. Maybe there was a perfectly rational explanation for everything. Then he spoke. Sit down, Miss Hensley. Her breath caught. It was him, the voice from the intercom. The man who had been speaking to the passengers, the man who had been pretending to be in control. Slowly he turned his head toward her, and she recognized him. 17A. The man who had been watching everything. The passenger who had known her name before she told him. The one who had warned her about the first officer disappearing. Naomi's pulse pounded in her ears. You're not a pilot. His lips curled into something like amusement. No, he admitted, but that hardly matters now. Her fingers twitched at her sides. Who are you? The man exhaled, adjusting the controls with practiced ease. Someone who was sent to clean up a mess. Naomi's throat tightened. You mean the first officer? He gave a slow nod. And Jake, and well, anyone else who asked too many questions. Her stomach churned. How? She whispered. How did you make them disappear? The man studied her, as if deciding how much to reveal. Then he simply said, There's always a way. She swallowed hard. Why? He tilted his head slightly. Because Celestial Airways pays very well to keep its secrets buried. Her vision blurred with rage. You're killing people to protect an airline? He sighed, shaking his head. Miss Hensley, you misunderstand. I don't work for Celestial. Naomi's breath caught. Then who? The plane lurched. Naomi barely had time to brace herself as the nose of the aircraft dipped slightly, throwing her off balance. The man smiled. I think we're done here. Naomi's heart slammed against her ribs. What are you doing? He flipped a switch. Landing the plane. Her pulse raced. You can't. You're not. But then she saw it. The autopilot. It was engaged. The plane was descending, not because of him, but because the landing sequence had already been programmed. He wasn't flying the plane at all, which meant he wasn't here to land it. He was here to make sure she didn't leave it alive. Naomi's mind raced. The autopilot would take them down, but if this man had come to clean up the flight, then there was no way he intended to let her walk off it alive. She had seconds to act. The man in 17A turned toward her fully now, studying her like a puzzle he had already solved. You should have stayed in your lane, Miss Hensley. Naomi's body moved before she could think. She lunged. She wasn't trained for this, wasn't a fighter, wasn't someone who knew how to take down a man twice her size, but survival was a powerful instinct. Her hand shot out, grabbing for the first thing she could reach, the headset hanging from the console. She yanked it free and swung hard. The metal casing struck his jaw with a sickening crack. He grunted, stumbling sideways, but he recovered too quickly. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, twisting. Pain flared up her arm, but she didn't stop. She slammed her knee into his ribs. He cursed, shoving her backward. Naomi hit the control panel hard. Alarms shrieked. The plane jolted. Passengers screamed from the cabin. The man cursed again, lunging forward. But Naomi was faster. She slammed her elbow into his throat. He staggered back, gasping for air. She didn't wait. She reached for the cockpit door and wrenched it open. Claire was already there, her eyes wide with horror. Naomi shoved past her. Lock the door! Claire hesitated for half a second, then slammed it shut. The sound of the emergency lock engaging was the sweetest sound Naomi had ever heard. She turned, panting. The plane was still descending. The ground was coming fast. And behind that locked door, the man who had tried to kill her was trapped in a cockpit with nowhere to go. The landing was rough, the kind that made passengers grip their armrests and murmur nervous prayers. But the plane touched down in New York, and Naomi was still breathing. When the doors finally opened, the authorities were already waiting. The moment the cockpit was breached, the man in 17A was pulled out, handcuffed, and dragged away. His face was calm, too calm. As they led him past Naomi, he caught her gaze and smiled. Naomi's stomach twisted. This wasn't over. She knew that now. Celestial Airways had covered up countless secrets, and people like him were paid to keep it that way. As the flashing lights of law enforcement surrounded the plane, Claire touched Naomi's arm. "Are you okay?" Naomi exhaled. She wasn't okay, but she was alive. And for now, that would have to be enough. Trust your instincts, question everything, and never ignore the warning signs, because sometimes the truth is buried under layers of silence, waiting for someone brave enough to uncover it. Naomi's story reminds us that corruption thrives in secrecy, and those who dare to expose it often face the greatest danger. But in the end, courage is the only way forward. What would you have done in her place? Would you risk everything to expose the truth, or stay silent to survive? Let us know in the comments below. And if you love stories like this, ones that keep you on the edge of your seat, make sure to subscribe. You don't want to miss what's coming next.